Hi, my name is Richard Winston, and I'm the Associate Professor of New Testament at Erskine Theological Seminary. And the purpose of this discussion is to introduce you to the book of Romans and encourage your own study of this great book. Romans makes a decisive contribution to the Bible's storyline. It sits really at the heart of what the Bible is all about. And so as a way into that book for you, to give you a front door, an open door into studying that book, I want us to talk about the purpose of the book, why Paul wrote the book of Romans. And so to get us thinking along those lines, I want you to do this mental exercise with me. When you think about the book of Romans, what are the first things that come to mind? When you think Romans, what pops into your head? Maybe you thought of ideas like justification, sanctification, Christian living, election, Romans 9, Martin Luther. Now do this exercise with me. When you think of the book of 1 Corinthians, what things come to mind? Maybe you think about divisions in the assembly, and a moral person whom Paul says they should discipline out of the assembly. Divisions between the rich and the poor, whether or not Christians can sue one another, spiritual gifts, the Lord's table, conflict between Paul and the people. Now, think of those two lists, the one you made with Romans and the one you made with 1 Corinthians, and tell me this, or you can just tell it to yourself, which one was more specific? I bet the 1 Corinthians list was more specific. It seemed more related to the specific congregational needs than your Romans list. And that is what gets us thinking about the book of Romans and its purpose. I suspect that when we think about the book of Romans, we think about it in more abstract terms. We think about it in more doctrinal terms. We think about theology. But we might not think about actual concrete situations that Paul was trying to address. Now, don't misunderstand me. Those are great things. You know, the doctrine of justification is a wonderful Christian treasure. Martin Luther's rediscovery of it affected not only church history, but world history. So it's a precious, precious doctrine that we appreciate. You've probably found new life in your Christian life by becoming more acquainted by that doctrine. So it's not a critique in any way of that. It's just to ask the question, why did Paul focus on that truth in this book? Why talk about justification the way he did in Romans when he doesn't devote as much attention to it in, say, 1 Corinthians? What is it about Rome that makes Paul need to focus on that truth? What practical problem was he trying to solve, if any? And how does that doctrine contribute to the solution? See, if we know that, then we can start thinking about our own churches, our own context, what needs exist there, and what truths might help address those needs and meet those problems or solve those problems. And so in order to be able to do that with the book of Romans, we need to consider its purpose. And in order to consider its purpose, we need to start at the back of the book. So we're going to begin at the end. Now, in beginning at the end of Romans, I am borrowing a strategy from a recent book by Scott McKnight entitled Reading Romans Backwards, A Gospel of Peace in the Midst of Empire. And McKnight employs this strategy of reading Romans backwards in order to show that the book was written to meet particular needs in a particular church. And so what McKnight argues is, the bulk of the content in Romans is driving towards the payoff that you really get at the end. And so unlike in 1 Corinthians, where Paul just kind of jumps right in, here's the problems I've heard about, okay, and then you wrote to me about this, Paul takes a lot more time laying a foundation, a doctrinal foundation, a theoretical foundation, talking about various truths and telling a story before he finally says, okay, now here's where it was all going. This is the problem I'm trying to solve. And he gives his most specific attention, description of that problem in Romans 14 and 15. So that's why we begin at the end. If Paul is trying to solve particular problems and we find out what those problems are at the end, then let's start there. Let's understand the problems that called forth the book of Romans, and let's focus on the most specific description of those, which we find in Romans 14 and 15. And then with those problems in mind, we can start thinking about the earlier parts of the book and why Paul said what he did and how it might meet that need. So the first goal in Romans studies then is to understand the purpose for which Romans was written and to recognize the problem that Paul is trying to solve.